Hello my crafty friends, this is Monica from Allsewpetite. In this tutorial I will show you how to draft a pattern for the diagonal zipper pocket like this one. So you can add it to any project you want. So if this is something you would like to learn, then keep on watching. Okay, let's imagine this is the front of our bag or backpack where we want to install that diagonal zipper pocket. So usually I would recommend that you're going to transfer the original pattern on a separate piece of paper and do it without the seam allowance because it is much easier to work and amend the pattern pieces. Okay, so let's say I want to measure 5 centimeters from this corner and 5 centimeters from this corner, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line. That's where I want my zipper pocket to be installed. So now you can take your zipper tape and you want to measure the width of your zipper tape. So my zipper measures 32 millimeters. Now you need to decide what seam allowance you're going to use when sewing the zipper. So when our zipper is here, you're going to stitch it on one side and then on the other side. I typically use 7 millimeter seam allowance on both sides. However, if you want to use 5 millimeters or maybe 1 centimeter seam allowance, you can. I'm going to stick to my seam allowance, which is 7 millimeters. So in total, that is 14 millimeters because we're sewing it on both sides. So now that you have those two measurements, you need to subtract the seam allowance from the zipper, and that gives me 18 millimeters. So 18 millimeters is the total width that my zipper will be visible. Now we're going to take that measurement and we need to divide it by 2. So if I divide it by 2, that gives me 9 millimeters. Now you're going to take this measurement and you're going to measure it on each side of this line, and then we can draw two parallel lines. Let's say I want my pocket opening to be 18 centimeters long. If you want the pocket to be exactly in the center, you need to find the midpoint. So I'm going to measure the center line. So for me this is about 29 centimeters. So that's 14 and a half. So I'm going to measure 9 centimeters on each side of that point. And then you can just draw lines. Make sure they are perpendicular to your line. So you want a 90 degrees angles. So this portion here is our zipper. And this will be our zipper tabs. Now that we establish where we want our pocket, we can draft individual pattern pieces. So to make this pocket, you will need two separate pieces for the external panel. So let's say this is the front of my bag. So I'm going to call it F1, and then this portion will be F2. So this portion is one piece, and then this is another piece. Then you have your zipper tabs, which we're going to draft as a rectangle so it is easier for us. And then you need two lining pieces to make the back of your pocket. One will be exactly the same size and shape as your F2 panel. So I'm going to call it P1, pocket 1. And then we need to draft another pocket piece that will be slightly longer. So let's call it P2. For this step you can use something like baking paper because it's quite see-through and you can see exactly what you're doing. So we're going to transfer individual pattern pieces now. So make sure you have enough extra space because we need to add seam allowance. First I'm going to transfer the F1 pattern piece. Once you've got that traced, it's always best to do additional markings so it is easier for you to assemble the pocket together. So either you can transfer the midpoint to your pattern, or you can make additional notches indicating where your zipper tabs are attached. So now that you transfer the shape of that pattern piece, we need to add a seam allowance and then label the pattern piece so we know exactly what it is. So if you are using an existing pattern, you know exactly what seam allowance was around that entire bag. So let's say it was 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to use 1 centimeter seam allowance around those edges. And then, as you remember, I used 7 millimeters around the zipper. So I'm going to only draw 7 millimeters around this edge. Here we go, just like that. You can extend those notches. And if you want, you can mark them. So this would be the midpoint. And this is our tabs. If you have any other markings on your pattern, make sure you transfer all those markings as well. So for example, I always like to have my grain line marked as well on my pattern piece. And then you're going to label your pattern. If you are using an existing pattern, it probably have a name, but for the purpose of this video, let's call this bag 1. And we know this is our F1 piece. So let's mark it F1, or call it whatever you want, but make sure you remember exactly what it is for. And you can also write what fabric this piece needs to be cut from. So this is going to be external fabric. So I'm going to write 1 time external fabric. Our first pattern piece is ready, so we can cut it out. Now we're going to repeat the steps to transfer and mark the F2 pattern piece. Again, remember that on this edge here, the seam allowance is only 7 millimeters, everywhere else is 1 centimeter. And because, as we established, this pattern piece is F2 and P1, I made sure I wrote that on my pattern label. And again, we know that we're cutting it once from external fabric for our front, and then once from our lining fabric for the internal pocket bag. Now we're going to transfer P2, which is the slightly longer pocket bag. So if you take your P1 pocket and P2 pockets and you compare them, you will see that this pocket is slightly longer. So the last pattern piece that we need is the zipper tab. Again, if you really wanted, you could transfer that shape and add the seam allowance all around. However, I prefer to just cut the zipper tabs slightly longer and as a rectangle. So usually what I would do is to just measure it. This is just over 6 centimeters. So I'll give myself a wiggle room, so 6.5 centimeter. So we would need to draw a rectangle that is 6.5 centimeters long and 18 millimeters wide, which then you would need to add 1 centimeter seam allowance all around. So that gives us a rectangle that is 38 millimeters by 8.5 centimeter. So if you want, you can draw that rectangle. Otherwise, what I like to do is to just take one of my pattern pieces and make a note that I need to cut zipper tabs 3.8 centimeter by 8.5 centimeter, and I need to cut 2 times external fabric and 2 times lining fabric. Now that you have all pattern pieces drafted, if you really want, you can use more sturdy paper. So take the paper and glue those pieces on top and cut it around. This way your pattern pieces will be more sturdy and they will last longer. Now you know how to draft pattern pieces for this type of pocket. So go ahead and watch my next tutorial if you want to learn how to sew it. See you next time. Stay crafty, friends.